Have you ever wondered why the story of Native American slavery is rarely mentioned in most history books? We all know about the transatlantic slave trade and the brutal enslavement of Africans, but what if I told you that millions of Native Americans were also enslaved, bought and sold long before and alongside African slavery? Their story has been buried, erased, and ignored, creating a forgotten chapter of history that everyone's afraid to uncover. The enslavement of Native Americans wasn't just an isolated event, but a dreadful system of forced labor, kidnappings, and brutality that happened all over America. From the moment European explorers entered these lands, indigenous people became prime targets for exploitation. Christopher Columbus himself was one of the first to capture and ship Native Americans as slaves to Europe. This was a cruel practice that only grew as Spanish, French, British, and Portuguese colonizers sought to profit from human bondage. But the truth is, Native American slavery didn't always look the same as African slavery. Many indigenous tribes had their practices of taking captives during warfare, sometimes adopting them into their communities. However, when Europeans arrived, they transformed these customs into something far more extreme: an organized, ruthless trade in native lives. Native men, women, and even children were torn from their homes, marched hundreds of miles and sold to plantations in the Caribbean, Central and South America, and across the American colonies. Some were forced to work under brutal conditions. Others were sent to die in silver mines, and many were trafficked in a hidden market that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. So, why don't we often hear about this? Why has Native American slavery been almost completely erased from history? Part of the answer lies in the way historical narratives have been framed. When African slavery became the dominant system, the enslavement of Native Americans was either phased out, mixed into African slave populations, or simply forgotten. Colonists who wrote history focused on their struggles and victories, while the voices of indigenous people, many of whom were wiped out by war, disease, and forced labor, were silenced. Another reason is that Native American slavery didn't follow a single, obvious pattern like the transatlantic slave trade. Instead of massive ships carrying enslaved people across the ocean, much of this enslavement happened through small-scale raids, local trades, and forced servitude in colonized territories. It was a more scattered, hidden system, yet just as cruel and devastating. However, this forgotten chapter of history shaped America as much as African slavery did. It built economies, fueled wars, and destroyed entire civilizations. Many of the roads we drive on, the cities we live in, and the institutions we rely on today were constructed through the suffering of indigenous slaves. Many enslaved Native people were forcibly assimilated, their cultures stripped away, and their descendants left searching for their true heritage. And here's the most shocking part. Native American slavery didn't just vanish with the end of colonization. Some forms of indigenous servitude continued well into the 20th century. Children were stolen from their families and placed into government-run boarding schools, where they were forced to abandon their language and identity. Others were used as unpaid laborers under the guise of apprenticeships or indentured servitude long after slavery was officially abolished. This is the hidden history they never wanted you to know. And in this video, we're going to expose the full brutal story of Native American slavery. After watching this, you'll never look at American history the same way again, because the truth is, the land we stand on today was built not just on stolen territory, but on the backs of stolen people. When we think of slavery in the Americas, our minds immediately go to the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, the forced capture and shipment of millions of Africans to work on plantations under brutal conditions. Most people don't know that slavery existed in the Americas even before Europeans set their foot on these lands. Indigenous tribes had their systems of captivity, forced labor, and servitude, though they functioned very differently from the chattel slavery that would come later. To start with, let's look at how indigenous societies viewed captivity, labor, and power before foreign invaders disrupted their world. Unlike the European concept of slavery, where individuals were seen as property, enslaved for life, and their status passed down to their children, Indigenous captivity was often temporary. In many cases, captives were assimilated into the tribe, eventually becoming full-fledged members. Some indigenous groups even used captivity as a way to fill up lost populations due to war or disease. For example, among the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederacy, captives were sometimes adopted into families that had lost members in battle. Women and children were the most likely to be absorbed into the tribe, while male captives might be ritually tortured or killed to avenge fallen warriors. The Comanche and Apache, both powerful tribes of the Great Plains and Southwest, also took captives during raids. However, instead of adopting them, they frequently used them for labor or traded them to other tribes. The Chickasaw, Creek, and Choctaw also participated in taking captives, sometimes using prisoners as servants or leveraging them in trade negotiations. Even in Mesoamerica, powerful empires like the Aztecs and Maya relied on captives as a key part of their society. This wasn't just about economic profit. It was about spiritual duty, maintaining cosmic balance, and demonstrating military dominance. One of the biggest distinctions between pre-Columbian indigenous captivity and European-style slavery was the lack of inherited status. In most native societies, a person taken captive did not automatically pass down their status to their children. Over time, many captives were allowed to integrate into the tribe and build new lives. In contrast, European chattel slavery was permanent, with enslaved Africans and their descendants doomed to generational bondage with no escape. Another key difference was the volume of enslavement. While Native Americans practiced captivity, it was often limited in scope. It was not an economic system designed to sustain entire empires the way plantation slavery did. Instead, captives filled specific social or political roles, replacing lost warriors, serving as temporary laborers, or acting as bargaining tools between tribes. However, when European colonizers arrived, they manipulated these indigenous practices and turned them into a vast, profit-driven enterprise. The same tribes that once took captives for survival or spiritual reasons were suddenly thrust into an entirely different system. One where human beings were bought, sold, and transported across continents as commodities. The arrival of Spanish, French, English, and Portuguese settlers transformed the nature of indigenous slavery. Before, captivity had been a part of warfare, diplomacy, and tribal survival. Now it has become a lucrative business. European traders and settlers saw native captives as properties, instead of potential allies or future tribe members. No different from land or livestock. One of the first recorded instances of Europeans enslaving Native Americans occurred in 1493 when Christopher Columbus returned to Spain after his first voyage to the Caribbean. He brought back hundreds of enslaved indigenous people, along with gold and exotic animals, presenting them as gifts to the Spanish monarchy. He justified this by labeling them as savages who could be civilized through Christian conversion. But make no mistake, this was human trafficking at its core. The Spanish encomienda system, established shortly after Columbus's expeditions, forced entire indigenous communities into slave labor. Although Spanish authorities claimed that indigenous people were merely protected subjects working for their Spanish overlords, the reality was brutal. Native men, women, and children were worked to death in gold and silver mines, suffering unimaginable cruelty. The English and French, seeing the success of forced native labor in Spanish territories, adopted their systems of indigenous slavery. By the early 1600s, Native American captives were being sold in markets from Virginia to the Caribbean, with some shipped as far away as Europe. Tribes that had once practiced small-scale captivity found themselves in a growing trade of human lives, whether as captives themselves or as participants in capturing and selling rival tribes to European buyers. Still, the damage had already been done. The centuries-old indigenous practices of captivity had been twisted and weaponized into a brutal transcontinental trade. For the European powers hungry for land, resources, and wealth, enslaving indigenous people was not just a convenience but a necessity. But what made Native American slavery so different was the way it evolved, how it was justified, and why it eventually became overshadowed by the African slave trade. Looking at the story of Native American slavery that began with Christopher Columbus. In 1492, when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he wasn't just searching for new lands, he was looking for riches. When he couldn't find enough gold to satisfy his backers in Spain, he turned to another valuable commodity: people. Columbus wrote in his journals about how easy it was to capture the indigenous Taino people, remarking that they would make good servants and could be taken as many as needed. By 1495, he and his men had kidnapped over 1,500 Taino, shipping hundreds of them back to Spain in chains. Those who remained in the Caribbean were forced into brutal labor systems, mining gold and working on plantations under horrific conditions. Many died from high workload, malnutrition, and disease, leading to a catastrophic population decrease. Within a few decades, entire indigenous societies in the Caribbean were wiped out. But Columbus was just the beginning. Once the Spanish crown saw the potential for enslaving indigenous people, it became an institutionalized system. As Spain expanded its empire across the Americas, the demand for labor skyrocketed. To sustain their growing colonies, the Spanish developed the encomienda system, a brutal system of forced labor that enslaved Native Americans under the guise of protection and Christianization. Under encomienda, Spanish settlers were granted control over large tracts of land and the indigenous people living on them. In theory, they were supposed to care for the natives, provide them with religious education, and protect them. In reality, it was slavery by another name. Native men were forced to mine silver and gold, work on sugar plantations, and build the infrastructure of the Spanish colonies. Women were often subjected to domestic servitude, sexual violence, and unimaginable cruelty. The conditions were so brutal that the indigenous population of Hispaniola, which numbered around 300,000 before Columbus arrived, had been reduced to less than 500 by the mid-1500s. Across the Americas, millions of indigenous people perished under Spanish rule. As reports of Spanish atrocities spread, some Catholic missionaries, like Bartolomé de las Casas, protested against the enslavement of indigenous people. But instead of ending slavery altogether, Spain and other European powers simply shifted toward enslaving Africans instead. Spain wasn't the only European power that saw Native American slavery as a profitable enterprise. Portugal, France, and England all participated in enslaving indigenous people, each having their methods and motivations. Portugal was heavily involved in the indigenous slave trade, especially in South America. Portuguese colonizers enslaved tens of thousands of indigenous people in Brazil, forcing them to work on sugar plantations. When the local populations resisted or died from disease, the Portuguese began importing African slaves at an increasing rate. The French focused on enslaving Native Americans in Canada and Louisiana. They formed alliances with certain tribes, encouraging them to capture and trade their enemies as slaves. French traders shipped many indigenous captives to the Caribbean, where they were sold alongside Africans. The British played a major role in enslaving Native Americans, especially in the American colonies. In places like Virginia, Massachusetts, and South Carolina, Native Americans were regularly captured during wars and raids and then sold into slavery. By the late 1600s, English colonists had created a well-organized system for enslaving indigenous people. Many were sold to plantation owners in the Caribbean, where they were worked to death under brutal conditions. Others were forced into domestic servitude or agricultural labor in the colonies. One of the biggest reasons Europeans targeted Native Americans for slavery was simple: profit. Indigenous people represented a free labor force, and enslaving them required no long voyages across the ocean. But there was another reason. Europeans justified their actions through racism and religious superiority. The Catholic Church, which held significant power at the time, issued a series of papal bulls that gave European Christians the right to enslave non-Christian peoples. Indigenous people who followed their spiritual traditions were labeled as savages and heathens, making them easy targets for European exploitation. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were bought and shipped in massive numbers, Native American slavery was often fueled by warfare and local conflicts. By the late 1600s, the enslavement of Native Americans began to decline, not because Europeans suddenly developed a conscience, but because Africans were seen as a more efficient labor force. Native American slaves often escaped more easily than Africans because they knew the land and had networks of allies who could help them disappear. Diseases decimated indigenous populations, making them less reliable as a long-term workforce. The transatlantic slave trade made African labor more accessible and economically profitable for European colonists. As a result, by the 1700s, African slavery became the dominant system in the Americas. However, that didn't mean Native American slavery ended completely. Many indigenous people continued to be enslaved, especially in the West, where the Spanish and later the U.S. government used forced labor systems well into the 19th century. The arrival of Europeans didn't just mark the beginning of colonization, it marked the beginning of a brutal system of native enslavement that lasted for centuries. Millions of indigenous people were captured, sold, and forced into labor, their suffering largely erased from history. While African slavery went on to dominate the narrative, the enslavement of Native Americans was the first step in a long, bloody process of exploitation that shaped the Americas forever. And yet, their stories remain largely untold. One thing is clear: America wasn't just built on stolen land. It was built on the backs of stolen people. The Indian slave trade was another brutal trade. A massive, yet often overlooked enterprise that saw tens of thousands, if not millions of Native Americans kidnapped, sold, and trafficked across the continent and beyond. It was a trade fueled by European greed, native alliances, and a brutal cycle of war and exploitation that reshaped indigenous societies forever. When European settlers arrived, they quickly realized that the easiest way to obtain native slaves was to exploit existing conflicts between tribes. Indigenous peoples had enduring rivalries just like any other group of nations or civilizations, and European colonizers wasted no time in weaponizing these divisions. British, Spanish, and French settlers encouraged native tribes to capture and sell their enemies in exchange for weapons, tools, and goods. Suddenly, what had once been traditional conflicts between tribes turned into full-scale human hunting campaigns designed to feed the European demand for slaves. South Carolina, in particular, became the epicenter of this trade. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, the colony had built an entire economy around enslaving Native Americans. English settlers and their native allies, especially the Chickasaw and the Westo tribes, launched brutal raids against enemy tribes, capturing thousands of men, women, and children. These captives were then sold in bustling slave markets in Charleston, where they were either forced to work on plantations or shipped off to the Caribbean, where the demand for labor was even higher. The impact of these raids was devastating. Entire villages were wiped out overnight, families were torn apart, and once powerful tribes found themselves hunted, enslaved, and sold into oblivion. The Appalachee, the Timucua, and many other once thriving nations were all but erased from history due to the relentless slave raids fueled by European demand. However, European settlers weren't the only ones responsible for the Indian slave trade. Some Native American tribes actively participated in it, either to gain European weapons and goods or to protect themselves from being enslaved themselves. The Chickasaw, for example, became notorious slave traders. Armed with European muskets, they waged war on neighboring tribes, capturing thousands of men, women, and children and selling them to the English in South Carolina. The Creek and the Yamasee did the same, raiding weaker tribes and delivering captives to colonial slave markets in exchange for guns, ammunition, and trade goods. For some tribes, participation in the slave trade was a matter of survival. They knew that if they didn't capture and sell other native peoples, they could easily become the next victims. It was a brutal cycle, one that forced many indigenous groups into impossible moral dilemmas. But while some tribes profited from the trade, others suffered severely. The Cherokee, for instance, were among those who tried to resist the European slave trade. But even they were eventually drawn into it, facing pressure from English settlers who demanded slaves in exchange for trade goods. Some Cherokee leaders resisted, while others saw it as a necessary evil. In the end, the internal conflict over slavery contributed to divisions that weakened the Cherokee Nation in the centuries to come. What happened to Native Americans after they were captured? The answer is horrifying. Unlike African slaves, who were often enslaved for life under European laws, Native Americans were subjected to a more unpredictable and brutal fate. Some were forced to work on plantations in the Carolinas, enduring the same backbreaking labor and inhumane conditions as African slaves. Others were sent to the Caribbean, where they worked under scorching heat in sugarcane fields, often dying from exhaustion and disease within just a few years. However, many Native American slaves were not kept in the colonies at all. They were trafficked elsewhere, scattered across Spanish, Portuguese, and French territories. Some were shipped to the gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru, where they worked to death in underground tunnels. Others ended up in European households, forced into domestic servitude in Spain, Portugal, and even as far away as North Africa. Women and children suffered some of the worst fates. Native women were often taken as concubines or forced into marriage with European settlers. Their identities were erased as they were absorbed into colonial households. Young Native girls were often sent to work as servants in wealthy colonial homes, while young boys were trained as laborers and expected to work until they were of no use. Perhaps most disturbingly, Native American slaves were considered expendable. Because they were easier to capture than Africans and often died quickly due to disease and workload, European settlers treated them as disposable laborers. They were bought, sold, and replaced at an alarming rate. And when they resisted, they were slaughtered in mass killings designed to instill terror among those who remained. The impact of the Indian slave trade was catastrophic. Entire tribes were depopulated, and their members were either killed, sold into slavery, or forced to flee their homelands. Some native groups, like the Westo and the Timucua, were completely wiped out and erased from history by the relentless violence of the trade. Others were forced to migrate, abandoning their ancestral lands in search of safety, only to be met with more conflict and displacement. The cycle of war and enslavement also created deep divisions among native peoples. Tribes that participated in the slave trade found themselves pitted against those who resisted, which led to decades of internal strife and bloodshed. The trade fundamentally altered indigenous societies, weakening them at a time when European colonization was expanding at an unstoppable rate. And perhaps worst of all, the horrors of native slavery were largely forgotten. Unlike African slavery, which left behind a wide record of documentation and historical acknowledgement, the enslavement of Native Americans was intentionally erased from the narrative. Many Native people who were enslaved were later labeled as indentured servants, or simply disappeared from the historical record altogether. This is one of the darkest and least discussed aspects of American history. It is a wound in Native American communities that has never fully healed. For over 2 centuries, Native American slavery was a brutal yet essential part of the colonial economy. European settlers captured and enslaved indigenous people, forcing them to labor in plantations, mines, and households across North America and the Caribbean. The enslavement of Native Americans was widespread, deeply entrenched, and often as brutal as African slavery. So why did it decline? What caused the shift from enslaving Native Americans to the near-exclusive reliance on African slaves? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't because of some moral awakening or a sudden realization that enslaving indigenous people was wrong. Instead, it was the result of practical and economic shifts. Factors like disease wiping out much of the native population, the increasing profitability of African slavery, and the changing policies of colonial powers. Native American slavery didn't disappear overnight, but by the late 1600s and early 1700s, it was declining across the colonies. Entire villages were wiped out within a matter of years. Historians estimate that in some regions, up to 90% of the indigenous population was wiped away from disease alone. Native slaves, who were often forced into harsh conditions with little food, poor sanitation, and exposure to European settlers, were particularly vulnerable. Enslaved natives frequently died within a few years of capture, making them a less reliable labor force in the eyes of European colonists. Unlike Africans, who were shipped in massive numbers and had higher survival rates in European settlements, Native Americans proved difficult to sustain as a long-term enslaved population. Colonists realized that relying on native slaves was not as economically beneficial as they had originally hoped. The mortality rate was simply too high, and as more indigenous people died, the supply of new captives began to shrink. As Native American slavery became less viable, European colonists turned increasingly to African slaves. The transatlantic slave trade was already in motion by the early 1600s, but by the late 17th century, it had grown into a massive industry. African slaves were considered more valuable by colonists for several reasons. First, Africans were far less susceptible to European diseases than Native Americans. This meant that plantation owners and other slaveholders didn't have to constantly replace their workforce as they did with native slaves. Second, Africans were easier to control. Unlike Native Americans, who were deeply familiar with the land and could escape to nearby tribes or wilderness areas, Africans were thousands of miles from their homelands. Third, the transatlantic slave trade provided a steady, almost limitless supply of African laborers. Unlike Native Americans, who were being wiped out by disease and conflict, African populations remained large and could be continuously captured and transported across the ocean. European traders, in collaboration with African rulers and merchants, established a vast system that funneled millions of Africans into slavery. By the early 1700s, the number of enslaved Africans in the American colonies had surpassed that of Native Americans. In places like South Carolina and Virginia, where native slaves were once common, African slaves had become the dominant labor force. Colonial laws even began distinguishing between Indian slaves and Negro slaves, with African slavery becoming more legally codified and institutionalized. Another major factor in the decline of Native American slavery was indigenous resistance. Native peoples did not passively accept enslavement. They fought back in countless ways. Some engaged in outright rebellion, attacking colonial settlements, freeing captive relatives, and waging wars against European powers. Others used their deep knowledge of the land to escape and rejoin their tribes. Unlike Africans, who were often trapped in foreign lands with no means of escape, Native Americans had an advantage. They knew the forests, rivers, and mountains like the back of their hand. Many fled captivity, disappearing into the wilderness where European settlers couldn't easily track them. Others found refuge in native communities that were willing to shelter them. The constant threat of escape made Native American slaves a less attractive option for colonists who wanted a stable, controllable workforce. Additionally, as European settlers expanded westward, they pushed native tribes further away from colonial settlements. Many indigenous groups were forced to migrate deeper into the continent, making it harder for colonists to raid and capture slaves. With native populations declining and moving away from colonial centers, the supply of enslaved Native Americans reduced. At the same time, European powers began signing treaties with certain native nations, some of which included agreements to stop enslaving one another. While these treaties were often ignored or broken, they did contribute to the gradual decline of indigenous slavery in some regions. While pure Native American slavery was reduced, that didn't mean indigenous people were suddenly free from exploitation. Instead of traditional chattel slavery, colonial governments and settlers found new ways to oppress and control native peoples. One of the most common ways was through forced labor systems disguised as apprenticeships or indentured servitude. Native children, in particular, were frequently taken from their families and forced to work for white settlers under the pretense of being educated and civilized. Many of these so-called apprenticeships lasted well into adulthood, with native people working under conditions that were little different from slavery. Another method was land dispossession. European settlers and the U.S. government systematically stripped Native Americans of their lands, pushing them onto reservations where they were economically dependent on the government. Without land, many indigenous people were forced into low-paying or unpaid labor just to survive. Even in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Native children were taken from their families and placed in government boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their cultures. These schools functioned as another form of forced labor, with children working in fields, kitchens, and workshops under brutal conditions. In the swamps, they built hidden settlements, fought against U.S. forces, and maintained a unique culture that blended African and Native traditions. Yet, despite their resilience, many were eventually pushed into reservations, enslaved again, or forced to assimilate into black communities, losing official recognition of their indigenous roots. Even after Native American slavery officially ended, the U.S. government found new ways to suppress indigenous identity. One of the most devastating methods was the use of boarding schools, designed to kill the Indian and save the man. These schools stripped Native children of their language, culture, and heritage, forcing them to adopt European names, clothing, and customs. Those who refused to comply were beaten, starved, or worse. By the time they reached adulthood, many had lost all connection to their original tribes, ensuring that Native identity remained fragmented for generations. But despite these brutal attempts at erasure, many indigenous communities have fought to reclaim their stolen history. In recent years, DNA testing, oral histories, and genealogical research have helped people uncover their Native ancestry. Some Afro-Indigenous communities, like the descendants of the Black Seminoles, the Lumbee in North Carolina, and the Mashpee Wampanoag in Massachusetts, have been working tirelessly to preserve their cultural heritage and gain formal recognition. However, the fight for recognition is not easy. Many Native American tribes today require strict documentation of lineage for membership, documentation that many enslaved Native Americans never had. For those whose ancestors were sold into slavery and stripped of their tribal records, proving their indigenous identity can be nearly impossible. The U.S. government's policies of forced relocation, land dispossession, and racial categorization have only made it harder for Native descendants to claim their heritage. Yet, despite these obstacles, the descendants of enslaved Native Americans continue to push forward. They are reconnecting with their lost traditions, learning their ancestral languages, and challenging the system that sought to erase them. From the rise of indigenous activism to the resurgence of Native cultural practices, a new generation is reclaiming what was stolen. This is why it's so important to tell this story, because the legacy of Native American slavery is not just a chapter in the past. History, as we've been taught, is often incomplete. Stories get rewritten, uncomfortable truths get buried, and in the case of Native American slavery, an entire chapter has been pushed to the margins of our collective memory. But even when this history is discussed, it's often distorted by myths and misconceptions that downplay the true horrors of what happened. One of the most common misconceptions is that Native Americans were only victims of slavery, never participants in the system. While it's true that many tribes were targeted and enslaved by European settlers, the reality is more complex. Some indigenous nations, especially those that developed relationships with European colonizers, became involved in the Indian slave trade. Tribes like the Chickasaw, Creek, and Yamasee allied with British settlers, raiding rival tribes and selling captives into slavery in exchange for European goods like firearms, tools, and cloth. These alliances weren't made out of cruelty, but rather as a desperate means of survival in a world where colonization was rapidly reshaping the balance of power. Also, some people assume that native slavery wasn't as severe as the transatlantic slave trade. After all, there were no massive ships packed with indigenous captives crossing the ocean, right? But make no mistake, Native American slavery was just as brutal, dehumanizing, and devastating. Enslaved Native Americans were sold in markets from South Carolina to the Caribbean, shipped off to sugar plantations in the West Indies, and forced to work in deadly silver mines in Spanish territories. Women and children were often the most sought-after captives, used as domestic servants, or subjected to horrific sexual violence. Native slaves were frequently worked to death, starved, and beaten, just like their African slaves. And in some ways, their situation was even worse. Unlike African slaves who were transported in large numbers and could form communities, native slaves were often scattered, isolated, and quickly replaced when they died. Many were shipped far from their homelands, cutting any connection to their culture, language, or identity. The high mortality rate among native slaves made them less profitable in the long term, which is one reason why European settlers later shifted their focus to importing African slaves. But that doesn't mean their suffering was any less horrific. Another major misconception is that Native American slavery disappeared once African slavery became dominant. But the truth is, indigenous enslavement never truly stopped. It simply changed forms. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, outright slavery of Native Americans became less common, but forced labor and indentured servitude remained widespread. Many Native children were kidnapped or coerced into so-called apprenticeships, a legal loophole that allowed white settlers to keep them as unpaid laborers well into adulthood. In California, for example, laws were passed allowing white settlers to hire Native people for free, often under the harshest conditions imaginable. Even after the abolition of slavery, indigenous communities continued to suffer under oppressive labor systems. Well into the 20th century, Native children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in government boarding schools, where they were stripped of their culture, language, and heritage. Many were subjected to physical and psychological abuse, forced to work for free, and punished if they tried to embrace their indigenous identity. This was a form of cultural slavery designed to erase Native people not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. Lastly, some believe that once Native slavery ended, the U.S. government made efforts to repair the damage done. But history tells a different story. Instead of offering reparations or protections, the government continued policies of land theft, forced removals, and cultural destruction. The Trail of Tears, the reservation system, and the continued marginalization of Native peoples ensured that indigenous communities remained impoverished and oppressed long after slavery had ended. Even today, Native Americans face disproportionate levels of poverty, discrimination, and social injustice, all consequences of centuries of systemic exploitation. The truth is that the U.S. government never made a serious effort to acknowledge or compensate for the horrors of Native American slavery. Instead, this history was deliberately erased, rewritten, or ignored, leaving generations of indigenous people to struggle with the legacy of a system that stole their ancestors' freedom, labor, and dignity. These myths about Native American slavery aren't just innocent misunderstandings. They are an effort to downplay the full extent of indigenous suffering in America's history. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Because only if we face history can we begin to seek justice, recognition, and healing for those whose voices have been silenced for far too long.